Hi, Horseless Carriage Days by Maxim, Chapter 2, Part 2. I will start at the bottom of 17 and continue. That'll repeat one paragraph. What possibly could be the trouble? A real healthy spark, all kinds of gas, and yet not one single explosion. I began to suspect the mixture and to try it. I decided to run the engine with the needle valve closed and no gasoline dripping. When the rags had become dry, I would slowly open the needle valve and thus gradually richen the mixture from pure air to maximum richness. Stone concurred in this. Concurred in this and urged prompt action. As his train left on the Sangus branch just back of the shop at 6:15, and it was then 5:45. With the gasoline shut off, but the rags still wet, I pulled the shipper over again. The lathe turned a few times when, without the slightest warning, what seemed like the most frightful machine gun fire cut loose. I had never heard such a terrible clatter. Noise came from everywhere. Something was buzzing around under my nose at tremendous speed. Fire was spitting out of everything, and smoke, smell, and confusion reigned supreme. We had no warning at all. Hell just broke loose, and there we were, right in the middle of it. Stone leapt for the door and paused in the doorway to cast a horrified look back to estimate the damage. Every toolmaker scrambled to a position that suggested preparation for dodging flying missiles. Not a one of them ever had heard such an astonishing noise. I gave an awful jump, and by either accident or intent, threw the shipper back and shut off the power. Instantly quiet fell. It came as suddenly and as unexpectedly as the noise. Blue smoke filled the room and curled out of the exhaust pipes of the little engine. My engine had run. But how differently from the way I had imagined it would. I had pictured in my mind a sweet running little sewing machine effect, whirling around, just hungering to be harnessed to the tricycle. Instead, here was the most savage, impetuous noise and riotous little spitfire that the mind of man could conceive. There was some tall thinking done that evening. I had my first real disillusionment. The nature and general temperament of the gasoline engine was not at all what I had pictured. This larger aspect of things dwarfed the small question of what finally made it start. I was hit pretty hard, having no previous experience in a field where most of the fundamentals were new and unknown. I found things looking pretty foggy. I have to confess that I was afraid of the little engine, too, for it had given me a very bad fright. If it was going to go off like a bunch of cannon crackers every time I started it, there was not so much fun in fooling with it. But time straightened out a lot of the confusion, and after a few days I began to cheer up. The noise and fire spitting could be handled in a muffler. The ignition probably had been all right from the beginning. I would not need the factory lighting system. The trouble all along had been with the mixture. The rag carburetor would not do at all. It offered too much hangover effect. I would have to make a mixture control valve that would give me positive control of air and gas. Probably a mere tank, with the air passing over the top of the gasoline, would give me enough gas. I had better not bother any more with the lathe. Hand cranking was laborious, but it was safer. But I had yet failed to grasp the necessity for some sort of load to put on the engine. This necessity was to be shown in due time. It may have been a month before I made another trial. This month was consumed in building a combined mixture and throttle valve. The three exhausts were piped together and led away where the noise, smoke, and fire would not be directly under my nose when cranking. When all was ready, I very gingerly cranked her over. The awful fright she had given me was still fresh in my mind. I cranked while Leonard Stone adjusted the mixture. When I was exhausted, he cranked and I adjusted the mixture. I suppose we cranked for an hour with no results. Again, suspicion fell upon the ignition, but I was not for going back to the factory lighting system. After an hour, when we were both rather wilted, we sat down to think it over. It was very discouraging to me, but I insisted it ought to work. Some little thing was wrong. The problem was to find out what it was. After possibly 15 or 20 minutes of talking and wondering, but not arriving at any decision, I idly walked over and grasped the handle of the crank and gave the engine a whirl. Bang! She went off like a thing possessed. It seemed to me I never saw anything turn so fast. She roared and shook and spat oil at me and seemed possessed to tear herself to pieces. While I was still in a state of complete funk, she stopped as suddenly as she had started. I looked at Stone, and Stone looked at me. She had steadfastly refused to budge during an hour of cranking. Then, after 15 minutes rest, and doing absolutely nothing to her at all, she started on the first pull. How could that be explained? I found out later, but it was many years later. And I had designed and built many engines in the meanwhile. The trouble was, first, that there was no load of any kind on the engine, and so it ran away. When one started, or raced, as we say. Second, that it had smooth steel cylinders and smooth explosion heads, which did not offer enough heat dissipation. Third, that it got very hot, which caused the pistons to seize and stick. And finally, that the spark coil sucked such huge draughts of current from the batteries that the latter quickly ran down. After the rest, while we were talking, they arrived. I was encouraged my engine would run. The laws of nature still held. What I needed was a load so that it would not run away or race. I winced when I recalled that it had never occurred to me while the engine was running to close the throttle and control the speed. Another month rolled around before I made up my mind about the next move. This was to place the engine on the tricycle and let the driving of the tricycle be the load. When the engine started, it would drive me along, and I was crazy to be driven along. If I could manage to maintain enough presence of mind, I could accept the opportunity to manipulate the mixture valve and the throttle. One night, while lying in bed, it struck me that watching the road and steering the machine might well be added to the list of things to be done once the engine started. I was particularly pleased with the prospect of avoiding the hand cranking. Pedaling the tricycle would be an easy way of cranking the engine. I decided that while a clutch was desirable in the interest of simplicity, I would let it go for the present. My error here was in not adhering to the stationary test until I had mastered all the troubles. It would be time enough to take the machine out on the road when I had it where I could start it, control it, and keep it going for more than a minute. But I was too young, too inexperienced, and too impatient. I am staggered now as I realize how little I knew about the gasoline engine and that time, and also how little about research procedure. Science classes are good for that. It took a long time, but I finally had everything fixed up on the tricycle. It pleased me immensely. To anyone who did not know gasoline engines and their habits, the outfit looked very businesslike. It is shown in Figure 1 with me in the saddle, the flimsy front wheel and tire, which were to nearly kill me later on, should be particularly noted, it should also be noted that the person seated in the front seat would have almost in his lap the hot little spitfire of an engine. The gasoline tank carburetor, which just barely cleared the road, will excite a smile today. Oh my goodness, we have to find figure 1. I don't know where all his figures are. Come on, figure 1, where are you? Oh, there they go. I think those are the figures. It's an interesting idea to put the pictures elsewhere. Okay, I'm seeing some different horseless carriages and some pictures of men. Figure 1, though. Figure 36. I don't want figure 36. I want figure 1. Okay, there's some figures here, too. Okay. I've got it. Figure 1. I found it. It is awesome. There is figure 1. Interesting tricycle with the engine right there, and that gentleman sitting there. So that's figure 1. And guess what I didn't do? I let go of my spot. I certainly did. Okay, the end of the hill. Oh, no, we're not there yet. Okay, I read that. My error here was in not adhering to the stationary tests. Okay. Cleared the road. In figure 2, the details of this intriguing machine are shown to better advantage. The engine is entirely exposed to the elements, dust and mud. The 3 exhausts are connected, but left to bark directly out into the air and almost directly at the exposed camshaft. The condition of the front tire may be judged from the wire wrappings, which will be noted at 2 points. This loose tire was destined to cause a near wreck of the entire machine. The enormous spark coil, which drained my little battery so successfully, will be observed fastened to the tricycle frame. The batteries themselves will be seen under the rear saddle. The camshaft, its bearings, and the exhaust cams are all unprotected, as indicated in the photograph. On a muddy road, one can picture what the front wheel would throw on this poor little camshaft. Many other details will strike the modern automobile engineer as naive. In 1894 and 1895, however, we did not know even the fundamentals. All right, I got to go to figure 2. Well, I don't think it looks that much clearer, but I'm not an engineer person. Okay, so here's figure 2 at the bottom here where he describes it so nicely. I don't know, are you better at seeing things than me? It's kind of dark for me. And once again, why can't I keep a hold of that page? I don't know. Okay. After everything that could be thought of on page 22, that'll remind me, had been done, Leonard Stone asked me what I was waiting for. Said he, "Why don't you take her out and give her a whirl?" I had to confess, frankly, that I did not have the nerve. This acknowledgement settled the matter and forced me to get up the necessary nerve. Not me. Soon afterward, I arose at daylight one morning, when the streets of West Lyon had the minimum number of people on them, and went to the factory. I shall never forget my sensations as I pushed that machine into the cruel outdoors. I have made countless first trips since, but never did I feel so low in my spirits and so self-conscious as on this one. It had to be gone through with. However, and I was going to do it. Once out, I mounted and headed down the driveway between the welding company's plant and the Thompson-Houston shipping department. I had a sickening feeling that I would soon have a crowd surrounding me. Added to this was the deep-rooted belief that the machine was not going to perform. Trouble seemed to be in the air. Halfway down the driveway, the first of this trouble developed. I had not the strength to pedal the machine more than a few yards. The engine was connected by sprockets and chain to the regular driving system of the tricycle. When the tricycle moved, it turned the engine. My hope had been that this would start the engine, after which the engine would drive the tricycle. This hope was blasted, and here I was, stuck before I could get out of the driveway. It would require a team of dray horses to pull that tricycle and spin the engine at the same time. The idea occurred to me to take the chain off the engine sprocket. This would make the tricycle free of the engine and enable me to pedal the machine to a certain street where there was a pretty good hill. Arrived at the top of this hill, I could replace the chain on the downgrade. I ought to be able to pedal the machine long enough to start the engine. Fearing some kind of an emergency such as this, I had brought along an assortment of tools, a screwdriver, and a small wrench, disconnected the chain, and I could pedal the tricycle, although with about 4 times the effort required to propel my bicycle. The streets were empty, and I ground my way along, being forced to dismount and push several times. Arrived at the top of the hill, I had another sinking spell. It seemed a very steep hill. Moreover, the surface was sadly out of repair. There was a discouraging amount of loose gravel and stones. We had very little asphalt in those days, not a foot of concrete, and very little decent macadam. M-A-C-A-D-A-M. I replaced the chain and made a mental inventory of the many things I had to remember to do. I turned on the ignition switch, set the throttle wide open, set the mixture rich, and mounted the rear saddle. The hill looked positively appalling, but the business had to be put through, so I started. It required terrific pushing on the pedals. When I had the machine off the level and on the down grade, I expected it would be easier. To my consternation, I could barely keep it going even on the downgrade. The rear wheels skipped in the loose stones at every compression of the engine. I ran the gamut of the mixture valve. I believed a rich mixture was what was needed. In later years, I found that these combined tanks and carburetors, that the jiggling over a rough road splashed the gasoline around inside the tank, and a lean setting of the valve was necessary to obtain an explosive mixture. But I was blissfully ignorant of all this that early morning in Lynn. The end of the hill was much steeper than the top. As I entered it, the grade seemed positively terrifying. To add to the complication, the surface was much rougher and more stony. The rains had washed little gullies and left an abundant supply of loose stones. I arrived at the steep and stony place by dint of hard pedaling without the slightest response from the engine. Having exhausted my repertoire on the rich end of the mixture, I thought I might as well try the lean end before I finished. I had no more than pushed the little handle over to the lean side when there came a terrific snapping noise and what seemed to be a rear-end collision. I firmly believed something big had fetched away up on the top of the hill and had come down and hit me in the rear. The tricycle gave a lunge ahead and started for the bottom of the hill, hell for leather, regardless of loose stones, rocks, and gullies, at a speed that seemed nothing short of horrible. Careening, sliding, spouting, loose stones, fire and smoke, it roared ahead. I had all I could do to keep aboard and steer. As for manipulating throttles and mixture valves, I was many times too busy to think of such details. I suppose the run lasted less than 10 seconds. It seemed to me 10 minutes. Then the front wheel struck a gully that ran off sideways. The tire of the front wheel decided to follow the gully. It never would have done to have followed that gully. I saw that at a glance, so I yanked the handlebar around. This pulled the wretched tire off the front wheel and snarled it up in the front fork. The front wheel thereupon cramped completely around the doubled under and the rest of the tricycle, and I catapulted over the top. And that's part 2.